I think that this was really seen as a political message, like a new king has come and he is Lord, and we are citizens of another kingdom. And we're going to do this in a way that honors the current governing structures of the world because they are, as Paul says in Romans 13, they're ministers of God to do good or to create order in society. But we're not ultimately trying to pledge our allegiance to any kind of secular system of government. We are fundamentally in a different kingdom.
Hi, welcome to Jeremy Pryor's podcast, or what I like to call Jeremy Pryor Unfiltered. I'm his daughter and producer, Kelsey Gall, and we are excited to bring you seasons of content all the way from Tolkien to theology, from business to family. If you like to contemplate deep philosophical ideas across a wide range of topics, you've come to the right place. Make sure you give us a follow so you don't miss out on future episodes.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Family Teams podcast. I'm here with Phil and Kyle. Thank you guys for joining me today.
Absolutely. Yeah. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, so Phil is zooming in from Athens, Georgia, yeah? And
That's it.
Kyle's down in Knoxville, Tennessee. So yeah, excited to chat with you guys. So I wanted to look at a video, a CNN, Fareed Zakaria. He's kind of their almost resident media philosopher. And he's always has an interesting take on some things. And he kind of did a deep dive on the impact that religion has had on politics. And so in this political season, I wanted to take a look at that, and also more from the lens. We're going to look at a lot of these issues, but I think it's really important for us to think about this from the family lens and get your guys' take on this. So I'm going to play. I'll make a few little comments on his take, and then we will also get you guys to chime in here.
Industrial countries in that it remained religious. But around the 1990s, that began to change, and the numbers plunged after 2007. As the scholar Ronald Inglehart has shown, since that year, religious decline in America has been the greatest of any country of the 49 surveyed. By one measure, America today is the 12th least religious country on earth. In 1990, according to the General Social Survey, less than 10% of Americans had no religious affiliation. Today, it's around 30%.
Right. Yeah, that is an incredible decline. I don't think I've ever heard that statistic before. 9% that had no religious affiliation, and today it's 29%, according to the graph here.
Why this is happening is not easily understood, but some of it is probably that the onward march of science, reason, and skepticism has fueled secularism in most rich countries.
I don't think that's been happening all over the place and hasn't really impacted America until recently. So I think something a little different is happening here.
But it might also relate to certain choices that American Christianity has made over the last decades. In his important work, American Evangelicalism, James Davison Hunter points out that evangelicals grew their numbers by adapting to an America that had become much less religiously observant and devout. The old Protestant fundamentalism had been filled with warnings against sin, heresy, Catholicism, adultery, divorce, materialism, and any deviation from strict Christian morality. But preachers like Jerry Falwell made the religion more user-friendly and less doctrinally demanding. What filled the place of religious doctrine was politics. Over the last few years, this process has been extended even further with those who consider themselves devout Christians, defining their faith almost entirely in political terms.
So I think that's an interesting statement. I want to let him tease this out a little bit more, but he's saying that one of the things that's occurred is that within Christianity, we have begun to define ourselves politically. Now, I think that that's a perception, especially when you look at the things he's about to say here. This is what he's calling political terms.
By opposing abortion, gay marriage, and transgender rights. This, in turn, has led to a great democratic de-churching. According to Gallup, Democratic church membership was 46% in 2020, down from 71% 2 decades prior. The scholar David Campbell of Notre Dame told the AP, increasingly, Americans associate religion with the Republican Party. And if they're not Republicans themselves, they turn away from religion. This phenomenon of the right using, even weaponizing religion is not unique to America or Christianity. You can see it in Brazil, El Salvador, Italy, Israel, Turkey, and India, among other places.
And he's going to dive into this in a second, but I think the thing that's really difficult to figure out in the way he's framing this is, has religion become more political or has politics become more religious? And so he's kind of making the case that in this part of it, that religion has become more political. Then he's going to make the case that politics has become more religious, which is, I think, a lot closer to at least what I've experienced. I'm really curious to get your guys' take on that.
Secularization may be inevitable, but it does seem to coincide with a sense of loss for many, a loss of faith and community that might be at the heart of the loneliness that many people report experiencing these days. In my book, I quote the political commentator Walter Lippmann, who presciently identified this problem in 1929. Men have been deprived of the sense of certainty as to why they were born, why they must work, whom they must love, what they must honor, where they may turn in sorrow and defeat. As I write in my book, into this void steps populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism. These modern political forces offer people a new faith, a new cause greater than themselves, to which they can devote themselves. Hungary's prime minister expressed this articulately to Tucker Carlson in an interview last year.
There are certain things which are more important than me, than my ego: family, nation, God.
This is the great political challenge of our time. Liberal democracy gives people greater liberty than ever before, breaking down repression and control everywhere, in politics, in religion, in society. But as the philosopher Kierkegaard wrote, anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. Modern society gives us all wealth, technology, and autonomy. But for many, these things cannot fill the hole in the heart that God and faith once occupied. To fill it with politics is dangerous, but that seems to be the shape of things to come.
Cool. Well, I got a few thoughts on that one, but I wanted to hear from you guys first. Kyle, why don't we start with you? I'm curious what that clip started up for you.
Yeah, quite a bit. I mean, it definitely, a lot of it does ring true to me just in my own personal experience and my, my limited vantage point. I've certainly seen the rise of the mesh between Christianity and politics, and I've experienced it myself personally. For the last, most of my life, I've lived in the Portland, Oregon area, and was raising my family there. And just about a year and a half ago, we relocated to Knoxville, Tennessee. And so that move in and of itself, I think, gave me an even more heightened awareness of kind of the marriage of these two ideas. Coming from Portland, Oregon, things were a little bit more black and white. Christians, at least in my, the circles that I ran in, seem much more kingdom first, kingdom focused. It was just more of a black and white, identity to them as a Christian. But now moving from the West Coast all the way down to the South here in Tennessee, I see much more of a combination of politics and the Christian faith. And it's scary. In my opinion, it is a bit alarming, and I see some serious dangers with it. And so I'm really been processing it a lot just in the past year with this move across the country.
So, Kyle, are you saying so in Portland, your experience was that Christians were able to keep these realms more separate than what you're experiencing more in the South? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah,
Politics and
I
religion.
would say so.
Okay.
I would say in the Portland context that I was a part of, Christianity was much more the minority, and the Christians that I knew and interacted with were just really serious about their faith, and it seemed that their primary identity in that context was first and foremost more as a Christian, and then would go into secondary identities. Where here, there's certainly that, and I don't want to paint either side with too broad of a brushstroke, but my experience here is much more of a marriage of the two, where there is certainly just the cultural Christianity that's very prevalent, but there is a very heavy political annotation and context to that. It seems very hard here to separate the two.
Yeah. That makes sense. Phil, how about you? You're also in the South.
Yeah.
I'm curious. Yeah, what is this? How does it look like for you guys?
Yeah, this has been, like, something I've wrestled with a lot in the last few years. I have friends who are in law, and, spent a lot of time they inevitably kinda, I guess, in the, like, kinda sphere of law, if you're in that field, a lot of times politics are kinda getting meshed into that. You're handling a lot of things on the political side, legally. And so, my buddy who's been in that for a while, I get a lot of the legal side, but also kind of like a lot of the founding fathers' thoughts that or is his interpretation, right, of founding fathers' writings and thoughts and things like that, which are very heavily political, but also like very rooted in biblical worldview. And so you get a lot of that. I feel like on these, at least from what I'm getting from him, is a lot of the mesh of those two things of like trying to set up a political system that's based on as much as they could a biblical worldview, right? So which I didn't really hear much about that growing up. Like that was not really taught to me in school, I guess. I also, like when it came to, my household growing up, my parents never discussed politics. I don't even know if they discussed it with each other. It was kind of always politics was always something like you kind of just kept that personal, whatever. We don't even really talk about that because it seemed to create unnecessary divides between groups of people, especially like, in their church, they didn't want to experience that. Um, it would just if people are differing on their ideas politically, we don't want that to, like, be something that's dividing people, like, in the kingdom of God, So, there just wasn't, like, really a conversation around anything political. So,
Mm.
so now as I'm getting older, I'm getting all these different influences, good influences from good people, right? These are, like, believers, but they're all interpreting world events, US events, things that have happened the last decade, 12 years or so, and trying to process those, especially things in the political sphere that as we get older, I'm in my 30s, and so as we get older, a lot of these political things they influence us more than they did when we were in our 20s or in our teens. So we pay more attention. I definitely have paid more attention, since I've gotten older and, had salary jobs and things like just different things influence me in the way they never have in the past or affected me, I guess,
Yeah.
is a better thing. So yeah, I've wrestled a lot with this whole idea. So those are my initial things that
Yeah.
goes up for me.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Have you ever considered starting a family business so you can spend more time working as a family team? We've started a year-long coaching program called Family Inc., where you get weekly coaching with Jeremy, access to our video training for launching family businesses, and lots of ideas for businesses to start that are working for other family teams. Head over to familyteams.com and click Family Inc. to learn more, or to set up a strategy call with Jeremy to see if this might be a good fit for you.
Well, I think that one way to maybe process this that I've really struggled with is that you have, I think, an identity of like maybe a missionary in exile. And Kyle, that might be a little bit how people like lived like when they were living in the Northwest. I certainly felt that way when I lived in the Seattle area. It's like we are so obviously different that we're
Mhm.
having this sort of more missionary identity to the culture and thinking, let's just avoid politics and just completely stay in this realm that's kingdom oriented because we're not going to win anything politically. So you have that kind of identity, and you would see that, of course, if you move to a Muslim country, you wouldn't be like, "Oh, I'm here to take over politically." You would just sort of be, "No, I'm a missionary. We're here to help people understand the good news about Jesus and understand His kingdom." On the other side, you also have this idea that Jesus did he come to bring a kingdom, and what are the implications of that? And as you process that, one of the things that I found interesting is that within Islam and within Judaism, you have these sort of encoded political ideas, right? They actually have laws that were at least during some point in time in history designed to govern a nation. Within the New Testament, we don't have that, right? We have Jesus saying things like, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. We have Jesus saying to Pilate, my kingdom is not of this world. If it was, then I would, fight. But at the same time, part of what was really happening and what's, I think, just genuinely like there's so much tension around this topic in the New Testament. You see how there is a way in which saying Jesus is Lord is very threatening to the political rulers of the time. And oftentimes the persecution that the Christians would face in the first and second century was not necessarily religious persecution. That would happen, but it was primarily political because they wouldn't adopt the political stances of the people that they were that were governing the empire. And so this is a really difficult tension to try to understand, that Paul is saying on one hand, make sure that you honor the emperor and that you do abide by the rules and the general governance of your area, and you're only allowed to say Jesus is Lord, which is like one of the most dishonoring things that you could do within that culture that really held it Caesar at least at that time Caesar was like a god, and that there was a need to they saw that the Christians saw this as a tension. There was lines across which they would not political lines across which they would not go as a Christian community. And so there's a lot of tension in here, and within a democracy, of course they weren't dealing with a democracy. But I'm definitely like curious, Kyle, I'd love to hear your thoughts, like as somebody who's like lived in these two worlds, more of them sort of, I guess, the more missionary identity, and then now you're starting to really see, I think, a little bit more of a, so I guess, an identity that is exerting some amount of, hey, we have political influence, and part of what it means to actually believe that Jesus is Lord is that we're going to follow him within this arena. Is this a really clean arena? And a lot of, like, is it obvious to tell the difference between what is religious and what is political? To me, that it's that dividing line that I think is most important to stare at and try to figure it out. That line just seems to be moving, and it's almost depends on, like you said, Kyle, where you live as to where that line gets drawn. So yeah, how have you kind of worked through that tension?
Yeah, it's been really interesting, just kind of from my own, walk and personal experience. I think, for all of us, a lot of things begin to come to a head in 2020. And well, you probably go back to 2016 and the initial, run of Trump when things really started to heat up, but really 2020 and COVID and all of the politics that just got thrown right into our face and really affected us at a deeply personal level, affected our families, our children. That was one of the many, catalysts that led to our move across the country. And so there was a lot of political reasoning behind that, as well as many other reasons. And I know we're one of many, who have made that move. But it's also kind of led me to become more politically engaged than I was back
Mm.
in Oregon. And I would agree with that assessment of more of like that missional identity and lifestyle, living in a culture that's so opposed and you're in such a minority, versus a culture like the South where, everyone quote unquote is a Christian and it's much more acceptable and it's just not near as of a divisive thing as it is in the West and Northwest of the United States. And so as I began to engage more politically, have found myself in real tension between that line that you're describing exactly. Once we moved here, I actually got connected to a couple conservative political groups, and I've attended some meetings just to kind of see what things are about, and just to try and get involved. Because personally, I've seen what the politics and the bad policies can bring about in a city like Portland, Oregon, and I don't want to see that come to Knoxville, Tennessee. So, as a Christian, as a father, as a businessman, over all these different spheres, I want to be engaged politically. But as I have engaged in these conservative groups, which I think are doing some amazing work, it was very interesting to me, the mirror of God and the Christian faith and these political values and agendas. And my experience has been, that these groups are very Christian, that they pray at their meetings, that they uphold biblical principles and things like this, which I really resonate with. But there are certainly people attending these meetings who have no faith in God and are there, strictly for political reasons. And then there are people probably a little more like myself that are much more motivated by God and the gospel. And so that tension is very real. And how do I, walk this walk with Jesus, but yet be engaged politically and help bring about good policy and good change for our culture? So
Yeah.
I'm walking through that now.
That's good. Yeah, I wonder if part of the trap that I'm constantly wrestling with when it comes to the collision of these two worlds is actually caused more than we realize by the two-party system that we're in. I think that creates and part of what he was describing there, and I think this is incredibly unfortunate, is the idea that the religious is becoming associated with one party. That is a new move. In fact, in the South, like when I lived in the South, when I was in seventh grade, all my Christian friends were Democrats. And there was no tension between being a Democrat and a Christian, especially in the South. Now that flipped pretty hardcore, I think, in the '80s and got more intense, and now it's changed a lot. But there was no sense in which you would understand somebody's religious beliefs based on which party they were a part of, and I think that was a huge benefit. Now I think that the two-party system, it really makes it difficult to think about these things in a more granular, like you were saying, Kyle, like at a policy level, trying to understand, okay, like I'm not trying to associate with a particular party. I'm not trying to become tribal. I'm trying to understand what kinds of issues really affect society, my family, the future. And so I think that our system is really making this difficult. And I think the thing that a lot of people have reacted to is once it becomes tribal, once it's so clear that there's a two-party divide between the religious and the non-religious, I think this is devastating to our missional call of evangelism, right? Because all of a sudden people will want to hear about your politics before they will be interested in hearing anything about your faith. And they'll immediately want to pigeonhole you based on your politics into one tribe because that's primarily how they're finding meaning, right? And they see themselves from an identity level as somebody who's fundamentally opposed to you politically. Man, I don't know what, like, this is really getting intense. And he was describing as Zakaria in that clip, he was talking about, the shift happening in the last couple of decades, and that this is actually driving people away from religion. Man, Phil, what are your thoughts about that? Like, have you seen kind of a evangelistic or a missional challenge that's getting more intense or more difficult for us to like wade through as things get so much more political and tribal?
I hadn't thought about how that would affect that. Um, but I totally can see the logic train here of like, all right, well, if somebody's trying to first find out some political thing, they're gonna write off everything after that if I'm not in the same alignment with them. Um, that's like a very I really hadn't thought about that implication, but it's intense. I mean, my dad used to say like Jesus didn't really get involved in politics, so I don't either. So that whole idea of like avoiding it altogether so that he
Right.
can like basically like he can get to the heart of faith as opposed to like having to go through any sort of political walls. Which I think there's some wisdom
Right.
there. I always, but at the same time, I'm always like, well, but Jesus didn't live in a democratic republic. What if we have the
Right.
ability to make changes to things that are bad, in a system? But but yeah, I hadn't thought about the like the missional implication of that, like locally in the US, of having to kind of that being a potential like hurdle to get over for people.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, I've been wrestling with it a lot recently, and part of it is when I've spent a lot of time, especially recently, in different countries, and if you study like any democracy that's pretty much been created, any democratic system in the last 100 plus years, almost all of them went with a multi-party system, and what they do in these countries is that you vote for a political party, and there might be like 20 different parties, and so there's constantly like negotiating and there's pros and cons to every system. But almost no one, I don't know if anyone else has really chosen our particular system. And our system wasn't actually designed this way. Like the founding fathers wanted there to be no parties. And so that was they designed the our political system around the assumption that there would be no parties, and immediately two parties emerged. Because if you look at sort of the game theoretic elements of our system, that's really inevitable. It was sort of designed, but it was inevitable part of the design, but it wasn't an intentional part of the design. And we've been living with it ever since. And I don't, I people, it's like the only way to like adjust this is to have people that are in power vote for a system that gives them less power. And nobody ever does that in politics. So we're sort of stuck. once you once these things happen, it's like we are in this system forever until the next revolution, I guess. But I think that we're watching over a couple hundred years this two party system kind of harden. And one of the things that Zakaria is saying is, and what tends to happen in a two party system is you tend to begin to move your party around a particular very strong voting block. like a voting bloc can have a lot of power in a two-party system. And so what was identified was that evangelicals are a voting bloc that's really worth coalescing around. And then that created a a counter reaction, which is that if you get one group of people and like religious evangelicals to begin to vote increasingly in lockstep with a particular party, then the way that the other party is going to respond is they're going to look for people that feel disenfranchised by that party. And this is kind of the way a two-party system inevitably works. But again, it's like I'm just like, if you're kind of sitting back saying, I really want what's best for evangelism, you kind of would really be frustrated with this move. If you want what's best for actual policy, you might say, "Oh, well, let's play the game." Let's like really begin to um, try to get more and more power in one party. This is kind of what the Jerry Falwell response, and we're going to begin to move that in a direction that will, be advantageous to our beliefs around ethics or morality or justice. So this is a conundrum, and part of the reason why I think it's really important is that as things get increasingly political, the political realm is invading almost every element of family life, and I think people are going to see virtually all of those things through a political lens. Even when he said things like abortion, same sex marriage, he said all these were political. They didn't, they didn't used to be primarily political issues. They are today seen that way. But if you think about these things purely from an ethics perspective or a moral perspective, then you would, if everyone was religious, then they would first see these as faith-based issues of morality and justice, and secondarily as political issues. But in a increasingly secular society, they're seen only as political issues, which is, man, another, I think, really major blow to the ability to have just free conversations and relationships with people who have different opinions. So, yeah, Kyle, what does that stir up for you?
Yeah, a couple things. I think one, especially just looking at the younger generations, I think younger people especially are kind of attaching these biblical standards or ideas with the Republican Party, to and they're putting up a wall in between them and God because of it. And they're saying, well, if Christians are these hate mongers that believe all these things, I want nothing to do with God. So this new wall has really grown and it's gotten thicker and thicker. And so from a missional perspective and a, evangelism perspective, there is now this new barrier that has to be overcome to be able to reach, especially the younger generation. Certainly it affects everybody, but I think especially you talk about people in their 20s and their teens and these children that are growing up in this kind of environment. This is going to be just a massive hindrance to the gospel and to God. And so from a missional perspective, we need to be asking, what can we do to bridge that gap? And one thing that connects to me is that the gospel itself is a very political message, but not in the way that, our world would think it is. It's very political in that it's an announcement, the good news that the president of all presidents has been elected. He was elected on the cross through his death and resurrection. And now we're proclaiming this good news that, hey, the ultimate president is here and he has brought with him this new kingdom. And so it's a very political message. So I have found in this kind of more intense political environment, in some ways it's good news, or it's easier to bridge the gap in the conversation from a political conversation to a spiritual one because of that. People are longing for new leadership and they're longing for broken problems to be fixed. And I think as Christians, we believe and we know that Jesus is the answer to those things. And so it is in a political conversation, it's actually fairly easy to kind of stir that into a gospel conversation and a Jesus conversation. So I think there's some good news in the bad news of what this video is kind of showcasing.
Yeah, yeah. I find that, yeah. Instead of, I think one of the things that's occurring is, instead of avoiding it the way that I think we did when we lived in the Northwest, like you said, Kyle, now it's sort of like it's almost important to lean into it and talk about Jesus. Like there's something. Yes, it is true. I do believe in a different Lord. I am following someone, and it is this is a political thing. In other words, it's not political in the way you think it is. I'm a citizen of another kingdom, and I've been increasingly thinking about it in those terms. Like, there's these two categories that are so that are doing so much work in our minds. There's the religious and there's the political. The weird thing about the religious category is that I think that Jesus, the gospel, in some way, does away with that category. Like the more I think about it, the less, like every time I study the gospels, I'm just like, Jesus was so unreligious in any kind of sense in which, there is no more temple. Like and this is the reason why the early Christians were called atheists, because they didn't they would not follow in the they didn't do anything that was overtly religious. The most religious thing they
Mhm.
would do is participate in, the breaking of bread, the communion. But in the early church, that was done in homes, which is even crazy today. Like it's like you need a very religious context. But if religion is essentially a category that is completely gone, then I think that the kingdom and the gospel of Jesus was primarily seen through the lens of politics. It was almost an anti-religious political message, and so it addressed both, but it kind of dismissed the religious. And by religion, I really mean the kinds of like fixed traditions that you would kind of go through, like the various liturgies and things that you would do that actually had like serious power, that was believed to be, kind of reenacting things. Like, there is certainly that in baptism and communion, like I said, but it was done in such a non-religious way, just traditionally what people were used to in the 1st and 2nd century, that it was just seen as, you guys aren't going anywhere. You're not like, everything was religious. Every time you ate meat, you would have to sacrifice it to an idol. It was like such a part of society. And
Mm.
so I think that this was really seen as a political message. Like a new king has come, and he is Lord, and we are citizens of another kingdom. And we're going to do this in a way that honors the current governing structures of the world, because they are, as Paul says in Romans 13, they're ministers of God to do good or to create order in society. But they're not we're not ultimately uh, we're not ultimately trying to pledge our allegiance to any kind of secular system of government. We are fundamentally in a different kingdom, and so you would expect anyone who says that in any kind of normal political arena would be persecuted. And this is what Jesus said. Yep, and this was the way the gospel spread, was that you would make overt political messages in an atmosphere that was antagonistic to what you're suggesting, that there is a different king. You would then be persecuted, and through enduring persecution patiently, you would this was your primary way of doing evangelism. I mean, Jesus says this overtly in Matthew 24. He's like, they're gonna, as soon as you start saying these things, they're gonna haul you before governors and, all these places. And I don't want you to think about what you're gonna say in advance. Just say whatever comes to your mind. The Holy Spirit's gonna tell you what to say in those moments. You're gonna testify um, to me in those. But man, I think that in an empire that has a certain obviousness to it, like there's such a clean collision between Jesus is Lord and Caesar is Lord. What is the collision in a democracy? Like what is the lordship collision within our political system? Because we don't pledge allegiance to a president; we literally vote them out on a regular basis. Is do you guys sense where the allegiance collision is between somebody who's following Jesus and somebody who's a part of a democracy like we are in the states?
My mind, I don't know if this is accurate or not, but my mind immediately when you said that said, yeah, it's not to Caesar, it's to self. So it's like the allegiance that everyone kind of has to deal with is like, is me, am I, it's making yourself your own God, right?
Yeah.
And so if a policy, and one thing I've kind of noticed, I've almost noticed the opposite of kind of what kind of what we're talking about in some respects. So like it's polarizing in some respects that people will like almost abandon religious things in the political atmosphere of things. I've actually seen the opposite in kind of some of my circles as people who weren't seeking God in any way have started to note it. And a lot of these people are in, Kyle, like areas like you're describing. They're like in like very non-religious areas. As these like new policies, new things have gotten more popularized, they're like what they've seen the impact in their communities, and they're like, I don't want this for my family, but they still live in these places. And so they're actually turning towards like, what about, they're actually turning like some of these guys I'm chatting with, like, I'm actually wanting to take my family to a church somewhere because
Mm,
what I'm just like getting surrounded by is just, it's insane. Like what I'm kind of having to experience in this. And so I'm almost think people like turn to the Lord in those communities that have, I don't know, historically they've been like very just non-religious, and you had to be
yeah.
very overt if you were like about your faith. Um, but yeah, so I'm kind of getting off rabbit trailing off the question. But I think Jeremy, the question is self, right? It's not an emperor of a country. It's like what laws and policies best serve me as myself as an individual. And so
Mm,
um I mean we kind of see that it manifests in a lot of different ways through a lot of different policies. But
yes.
yeah, I feel like that's the big
Wow.
choosing
That's
factor
interesting.
people come back to.
Like what you hear? Be sure to leave a rating and review for this podcast wherever you use streaming.
What do you think, Kyle? Is that how you see it?
Yeah, that's huge. And I totally agree. And I think adding on to that is, you have God or Jesus as Lord over here on one side. And then increasingly the government has begun to fill that role and fill the needs in people's lives in so many different ways, to where historically it was the church that would come in and they would meet the need, and they would, establish these, hospitals and educational systems and things to help people. Now the government is essentially taken over that role, and the government is growing and growing and growing. And I think people are just becoming more and more dependent, and they're finding more and more of their needs met and putting more of their hope into the government, structure. And so it really is creating this massive divide between God and government as provider and, sustainer of a person. And
Mm,
so I think that's, still connected to what you're saying, Phil, but very much I see that playing out on an increasing measure as the years go on here.
yeah. Yeah. I'm constantly thinking about that quote from Franklin, wherever he said, as soon as people realize they can vote for themselves money, that'll be the end of democracy. And that's basically what you're saying. It's kind of bringing together both of your points, Phil. That really is the self that people are worshiping in a democracy. That's sort of the emperor. There is no king. I am king. That's what's amazing about
Mhm.
democracy. It's of the people, by the people, for the people, but it breaks down to the individual, which I think is really one of the things that's most challenging about having a multi-generational family message in a democracy is that there is, as the Kierkegaard quote that Fareed Zakaria quoted, what was it? Anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. The idea that if I begin to really see things from a hyper individualistic perspective, um, then I'm going to become anxious, because I have almost an endless amount of options, and it makes me dizzy. It's like, where do I go? I'm losing any compass, any bearing. And I think that part of why a multi-generational family makes sense in a culture in which there is a king that we're aligning to is that it always suggests that there is sort of, as opposed to the individual being king, there are basically these different communities, and we're all part of this one large community, which is the church, like the universal church under Christ, who is the head of the church. And underneath that, because we're all in submission to Christ, and we are laying down our lives and lifting up our crosses and trying to follow Jesus and not ourselves, then it does make sense of the ability to then form micro communities underneath that, of local churches and of families, but in a place in which, in a hyper libertarian or hyper liberal society in which every individual is king. And it's interesting to think about, Phil, when you said that, one of the things that kind of struck me is that when people when missionaries would go, like Paul would go into a city and begin to try to convince people that Jesus is Lord, and they would make that confession and be baptized and go through that funeral procession of dying to themselves, being buried with Christ in the waters of baptism, and then raised again. I don't because it's not clear in our society. I don't know if we're properly going through the renunciation of self in that same way,
Mhm.
and seeing that as a political act. And because this is something that I guess I really struggle with, because in the church, there's almost like we use the same language, like, hey, you need to get out there and vote. You need to make your voice heard. This is a democracy, and so we everything about democracy incites the idea of the individual and your don't give your power away as an individual. And so you want to incite that maximally, no matter what party you're in order to get people to take political action. Otherwise, the other side's going to just overwhelm us. But how do you do that in a way that doesn't then put you back on the throne, right? And this is what's so confusing because then of course as a pastor, um, I feel for pastors these days because it's like what do they say like in front of a church? Are you supposed to say, look, guys, because Jesus is Lord, we're going to actually talk very overtly about political policies that we think impinge on things that we believe that the Bible clearly communicates. Like, there's a strong argument for why you would want to do that. If you were renouncing self and basically handing our vote to Christ, why wouldn't we want to have that conversation as a community? But as soon as you do that, it's really perceived by the other side as being an act of political power grabbing over and against them, and then has all kinds of other implications. It The self could become aggrandized and take that position back where we're fighting as individuals with other individuals, or just all the sort of evangelistic and disciple making implications. So yeah, any thoughts about like how do we handle this in the context of Christian community?
Well, I think first and foremost, I mean, as Christians, we have to stand on the word of God, and that is the distinction. And even in that video, we showed what's his name, who began to, I think, water down the gospel and begin to make it more palatable to the culture and kind of grow in a seeker sensitive way that draws a lot of people to God and to the church, but not necessarily to that renunciation of self and repenting over sin and dying to oneself. And so I think that has to be part of the answer is we have to remain true to the word of God, and we can't falter on that as the church. And so when the government is putting out policies and putting out things that are in direct opposition to God, I, for one, as a Christian, am going to stand out. Not only am I going to vote, but even more so nowadays with, this change in myself and my family over the last number of years, I'm going to be engaged and I'm going to fight these wicked policies that are going to harm people and hurt people and that are antithetical to the ways of God. And so, we have to take the word of God as the foundation and the bedrock to which we engage any of these issues. And some of these issues that are not necessarily biblical or religious in nature, we need to, set those maybe in a different category and have a little bit different wisdom and approach with how we engage some of those. But over here, we have to stand very firm on the word. And then over here, pray and seek wisdom and, engage in those in whatever way we can.
It's good. Yeah, makes sense. Phil, any last
Yeah,
thoughts on that?
yeah, I think something else that's really important to do too, is to teach people to hear God themselves. So I think a lot of people that are coming into talking about these things, especially if they're coming from an opposite opinion, right? Or an opposite, they had a different upbringing or whatever. It's easy. For me, it's easy to just to like kind of to go at them with, yeah, well, here's what the Bible says, man. Like, here's line for line, whatever. But there's a lot more like emotional stuff involved within people's hearts from past histories of whatever, family stuff, friends, their own things. They may have been through some kind of abuse. There's like other stuff there that just presenting scripture, which is definitely a huge part of it. And I'm 100% for standing on it. But I think sometimes helping people to learn to like, hey man, don't take my word for it. Here's the Bible. I'm going to give you this, but I won't. You go talk to God. Like, go ask him. He will talk to you. He will communicate with you. He knows he knows better how to get to your heart than I do. And so I think I'm a part of like a Tuesday night kind of men's group thing, and the guy that kind of facilitates that, it's like a big thing of his. In general, tries to avoid anything politics in our discussions, but he's always encouraging people like, hey, you need to like go seek God yourself. Like, don't try to lean on the opinions of the guys in this group or the guys on some podcast or, some political leader. Like, you need to like go lean into the Lord and ask him to like teach you. The word says like the Holy Spirit's going to teach, the Spirit is going to teach the people. Right.
Yeah.
So go ask him. He wants to teach you. So I think that's another big part of it. Yes, giving people the word, but also like giving them the word and say, all right, now you go talk to God about this.
Yeah.
Like he's the ultimate authority here. So
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the renunciation of self, what that would look like in to your point about emotions, if people, I do think that a lot of what's happening is that once you are the God and once you are Lord, then why not just stop and ask yourself, how do I feel about this issue? It's like that becomes the governing um it really becomes the governing variable for how you approach any policy or how you approach any political situation. It's like I'm God, and so how do I feel? Well, the God myself, I'm having a reaction. I don't like this. I'm repulsed by it. It's possible, on the other hand, to have a if you're saying Jesus is Lord, it's possible for you to have an emotional trigger or repulsion for revulsion for something that the Bible is saying is true, and just being honest about that, and just saying, I'm not Lord, and so there's things that it's like that category is the one that to me I'm worried is starting to disappear. It's like the category in which we do have these conversations and say, look, because if I'm not God and I am listening to the Holy Spirit and studying the Word in community with other believers, then yeah, be honest about how you feel about any of these topics. But but you also have to understand that to say Jesus is Lord is to say that that's not the final word about what I believe about that or how I'm going to act in that area. That I'm trying to conform my life to the ways of Christ. So yeah, this is I kind of wanted just some time to process this, and this has been a really helpful conversation. So thank you guys so much for jumping on here today and chat with me about this.
Thank you for listening to Jeremy Pryor's podcast. Make sure you hit that follow button so you don't miss out on any future content. Follow Jeremy on Twitter and Instagram, as well as his Substack blog, all linked in the description. See you next time.